Early May 1945, Germany is defeated and lies in ruins.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hailed the end of the war in Europe.
In London, New York, and Paris, people are out cheering.
The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
The weapons have fallen silent.
Und ganz unten erst enden.
The 12-year-long Nazi reign of terror, which drove the world to the brink, is now history. An end and a beginning at the same time. But how do you build a new present with the burden of the past? How do you turn a dictatorship into a democracy? Let's take a look back at the post-war period in Germany and what was referred to as Zero Hour. Where was Germany at the beginning of 1945?
Dies sind die ersten Wochenschau-Aufnahmen des Endkampfs in Berlin.
In the spring of 1945, the Soviets reached the German capital, Berlin. On April the 30th, Red Army soldiers hoisted the red flag with hammer and sickle on top of the Reichstag. A few hundred meters away, Hitler had taken his own life hours earlier in his bunker. Like other leading Nazi officials who did the same, he evaded being held accountable.
In Germany, Heinrich Himmler avoids trial by suicide.
On May the 7th, 1945, Colonel General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of the German Wehrmacht. After almost 6 years of war, more than 60 million people had been killed. The Nazis murdered 6 million European Jews in the Holocaust. Other victims of Nazi atrocities included Roma and Sinti, Soviet prisoners of war, prisoners of other nations, people with disabilities, and gay people. In defeated Germany, destruction, hunger, hopelessness, and chaos reigned, the consequences of Hitler's failed attempt at global domination. German infrastructure was almost completely destroyed. Many residential areas had been razed to the ground. Major cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Cologne were almost unrecognizable. Many places were completely overwhelmed by the influx of 12 million ethnic Germans who came either as displaced persons or as refugees from Germany's former eastern territories it ceded to other countries. Most bridges had been destroyed and transportation routes were paralyzed. Industry had come to a virtual standstill. Millions of people had to make do without water, gas, and electricity. The Reichsmark had lost almost all its value. The black market flourished. Securing the bare necessities for survival was the biggest challenge facing people in Germany immediately after the end of the war.
Riesige Schlangen bildeten sich, wenn es einmal irgendwo fragwürdiges Fleisch ohne Marken gab.
They have brought the German people to the lowest ebb of wretchedness.
During this period of political, economic, and social collapse, the term Zero Hour was coined. It was supposed to symbolize a radical new beginning at all levels. But did it really exist?
As far as political attitudes are concerned, there can't have been a zero hour. People believed in the old regime right up until May the 7th, and from May the 8th they believed in something different. That would be a very strange idea.
The term was coined before the end of the war, in the hope that a complete break would be made with the Nazi regime. And within society in general, the term Zero Hour soon became a code for being able to hide the past under a cloak of oblivion.
Forgetting, ignoring, repressing memories of the past. Can a new society emerge like that? It was clear to the Allies occupying Germany that democracy had to be learned. But how? Prescribed democracy, a recipe for success? Germany's future was still uncertain after the end of the war. The country had been divided up among the victorious powers. At the Potsdam Conference, the UK, the US, and the Soviet Union agreed on political principles for the future of Germany. They included denazification, meaning the replacement of political elites, and democratization, for instance through reforms in culture, education, and the public sector. They also agreed that Germany had to be demilitarized. It was about changing people's minds, not through obedience, but by getting them to question their own ways of thinking and actions under dictatorship. At the time, many Germans simply wanted to draw a line under the past without addressing guilt, the war, and ideology. They wanted to be left in peace, to simply get on with their new life. But the victorious powers were very clear that Germans needed to be re-educated to think democratically. The Allies considered re-education absolutely paramount, and it included directly confronting Germans with their own past. The inhabitants of Weimar were given a tour of the nearby liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. The aim was for people to see up close what German Nazi ideology meant. Cinema-goers were shown the 20-minute-long film The Death Mills. It confronted them with the horror, death, and suffering that the Nazi regime had been responsible for. Fundamental reforms were made in cultural and school policy, and in public broadcasting throughout Germany. On October 6, 1945, the first edition of the Süddeutsche Zeitung paper appeared, just 8 pages long. The paper was initiated by the US military government, but run by German journalists.
Die alte Tübinger Universität wurde als erste wiedereröffnet.
The Nuremberg trials were another component of US re-education.
The most famous trials were those held in Nuremberg, when 21 high Nazis faced their accusers. Hitler was dead, but these were his chief lieutenants, Hess and Ribbentrop among them.
These trials were also designed to open Germans' eyes to the crimes of the Nazi regime. In the course of the trials, Germans were relentlessly confronted with the full extent of Hitler's fanaticism and its terrible consequences. In the major war criminals trial from 1945 to 1946, leading Nazi functionaries such as Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess sat in the dock.
Rudolf Hess. Once the third-ranking Nazi, Hess parachuted down over England early in the war.
Nein!
Wilhelm Keitel. The chief of staff pleads innocent.
Ich bekenne mich nicht schuldig.
12 more trials for lower-ranking war criminals followed until 1949. In Germany, these trials were met with ambivalence. They were seen by some as victor's justice, particularly because the alleged war crimes of the Allies, such as the bombing of German cities, were not prosecuted.
Initially, Germans are not only sympathetic, they are fully behind bringing the war criminals to justice. The trial of the main war criminals in Nuremberg was widely supported. And that was where the problem began. When they were convicted, most Germans thought, now we've got the really guilty ones, and that's that. The follow-up trials, which focused much more than the main war crimes trial on the individual elites of society, are about lawyers, doctors, diplomats, business people, and many more. These follow-up trials are much more sensitive for many Germans because they immediately pose the question of how far responsibility for Nazi crimes extends.
The Nuremberg trials were only the beginning of the public confrontation with Nazi crimes, but not everyone was willing to go along with it. All 4 victorious powers implemented a re-education program, but with very different interpretations. In the Soviet occupation zone, for example, there were re-education programs called anti-fascist democratic upheaval. The aim here was to educate people according to the socialist model.
Und die Helden der Sowjetunion marschierten auch dieses Mal in Gestalt gewaltiger Plakate im Geiste mit.
In the Soviet occupation zone, the major goal of the occupying power was to build a new society based on the Soviet model. We should not forget that a socialist society was one of the great hopes after the war, a real alternative to Nazi Germany. Many people invested not only their good intentions, but also their justified hopes for a different Germany. However, these hopes were very quickly dashed by state communism, which had little in common with the socialist ideal that many of those who had fought against the Nazis held in their hearts.
Another goal of the Allies was denazification, or removing all Nazis from the country's elite. But how could it be achieved when around 8.5 million Germans were members of the Nazi Party? Denazification, a new beginning?
In einem feierlichen Staatsakt wurde in München das Gesetz zur Befreiung von Nationalsozialismus und Militarismus von den Ministerpräsidenten von Bayern, Württemberg-Baden und Großhessen unterzeichnet.
The Allies agreed at the outset that top political and social positions needed to be filled by people who were committed supporters of democratic rules, or at least accepted them. As early as 1946, the Allied Control Council, the supreme occupation authority, issued the first denazification directive, including guidelines on how active Nazis and helpers and beneficiaries of the Nazi regime should be treated. Each occupying power, however, proceeded with varying degrees of severity.
Spandau wurde zu einer unheimlichen Mahnung. Hinter diesen Mauern verschwanden 7 führende Männer des Dritten Reiches, die im ersten Nürnberger Prozess verurteilt worden waren.
The US implemented a very bureaucratic denazification in its occupation zone. All adults received questionnaires with 131 questions. They were used to classify the Germans into 5 categories. 1. Main culprits. 2. Incriminated persons, often officials or military with close ties to the regime. 3. Lesser culpability. 4. Collaborators. And 5. Exonerated.
Only around 1.5% were classified in categories 1 and 2, i.e. the main culprits and incriminated persons. The majority of Germans were exonerated. As a result of the unpopular denazification program, which exonerated the majority, many former Nazi functionaries were able to take new positions and avoid further scrutiny. For a long time, denazification prevented the people who had supported the dictatorship from being punished.
In West Germany, former Nazi Party members were able to resume their careers in German government agencies and ministries. But denazification took a different course in the Soviet-occupied East.
It was about a new beginning, and this was initially pursued much more consistently and rigorously in the Soviet-occupied zone than in the Western-occupied zones of Germany. This is evident in the numbers of people who were dismissed, in the severity of punishments, but also in the way in which certain areas of society were permanently purged of the old elites. In communist East Germany, there was a complete replacement of elites in the judiciary and domestic administration.
80% of judges were dismissed because they had been members of the Nazi Party, but they were often replaced by what were known as people's judges, locals loyal to the regime who had little legal expertise and often handed down unjust sentences in the name of so-called socialist legality. How a dictatorship becomes a democracy. Conclusions. A real fresh start, or 0 hour as it was called, never existed in post-war Germany. The re-education and denazification programs were not able to transform a dictatorship into a democracy in a short space of time. It was a long, protracted process that proceeded very differently in the 2 Germanys. In East Germany, the economy was slow to take off. The newly founded communist state had to pay reparations. Its industry was largely dismantled by the Soviets. Railroad tracks, trains, and even entire factories were stripped. In the West, an economic upturn, support from the Marshall Plan, and the strengthening of civil society enabled West Germans to embrace liberal democracy. The Marshall Plan. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall presented the European Recovery Program. The U.S. provided loans and delivered goods, raw materials, and food. Eastern European countries did not participate in the Marshall Plan under pressure from the USSR.
Frühere deutsche Rüstungswerke fertigen jetzt Küchengeräte. Und aus Stahlhelmen werden Siebe für den Haushalt.
The boom and rapid development of the economy did naturally contribute to acceptance of and satisfaction with the new state. But I believe that these other factors, an active civil society, the media landscape, the independent judiciary, and oversight bodies like the Federal Constitutional Court, were much more important in terms of democratization. And the final point is the continuing process of confronting the past and the broad understanding among the population of Nazi crimes. Here we haven't reached the end of the story.
Germany's transformation from dictatorship to democracy didn't happen overnight. It took generations. Coming to terms with the past is an ongoing process. And maintaining democratic structures requires perseverance and determination.